Good morning. Good morning and hello and welcome welcome to those on the video. Um, Now the books have arrived, Lest Innocent Blood Be Shed. Last week we just did a little introduction to this since people haven't had a chance to have it yet. And if you haven't had a chance to read, well, we're just gonna hit some highlights. I have a whole list here of things that stood out to me. I'm not gonna do all of them, but if I have a little introduction and then we'll just open it up. And if you all have things that hit you, we'll share that. And if not, I have plenty to fall back on. What we asked folks to read for this week was the prelude, which is sort of the introduction, and then section 1, which is chapters 1 and 2.
Section 1 and then what?
Section 1 is chapters 1 and 2.
Because I got.
Yeah. And 2 gets into the background of the main pastor, Pastor Andre Trocmé. I do not speak French, so I'm doing my best guesses. Andre, I know, Andre Trocmé, I'm guessing. So probably most of what I'll bring up is just a little bit from the prelude and mostly chapter 1, but we might get into chapter 2 as well. From chapter 1, or from the prelude, excuse me, we had mentioned a couple of things, just reading a few passages together last week. We talked about painful joy, about how through this pain of looking at human suffering and cruelty and torture, this historian, who we find out is Jewish himself, found this joy, found unconsciously had tears streaming down his cheeks reading about this village of Les Chambon. We talked about too that phrase where he said he had dug himself into hell, studying these things to the point where he was desensitized to it and felt like he was kind of a monster for not feeling anything. But then if he did start to feel the emotions, he said it felt like he was just another victim and he didn't want to be another victim. And I just wanted to lift up what hit me rereading this was that you don't need to, nowadays, you do not need to be an ethicist researching torture and cruelty to kind of become desensitized. Because nowadays there is an overload and an onslaught of information if you turn yourself towards the fire hose. It's just out there everywhere. People around you are probably saying, well, didn't you hear about this? Like we have more access to more news, some of it important, much of it trivial, much of it is 24-hour news cycle of, well, let's just keep talking and speculating about this till we, drive it into the ground. Or you could say, I can have access to news up to the minute from around the world all the time. Now, folks back then, I think, were more worldly in some respects. If you look at newspapers from back in the 30s and 40s, they were covering stories from other parts of the world differently than they do now. So in some ways, I think folks back then knew more about the rest of the world than we do now. But there's so much, if not.
Because the people that they don't read,
Yeah,
they claim they get all their news from TV, and I guess I'm very biased because to me as a teacher, if you read it, you make up your own mind.
Yeah.
If you hear it from, CNN kind of has their slant,
Sure.
they're all kind of.
When news went to 24 hours, is when it went to
yeah.
hell.
Because instead of it being that, wow, we can talk about everything in the world, it just became loop on a loop.
A lot of it's almost more commentary than
Yes.
news.
Yeah.
Yes.
That's what irritates me is when somebody says it's supposed to be news and it's actually a commentary. They insult your intelligence
Sure.
by telling you it's news when you can see that it's
Either spin or
It's-
what they call
right,
infotainment.
yeah.
Where the newspapers
Yeah, it's
still
editorializing.
tend to just give the facts unless you read the editorial page.
And even newspapers have editors, right? They have
Right.
you're going to frame it somehow. You're gonna choose to leave some details in and some out.
Well,
But
and they
it
say,
feels slightly
they
more
claim
objective.
that certain newspapers are more one political
Yeah,
view than the other.
you see it in their editorializing.
you can,
So,
But if it's just straight up news, yeah, I see what you're saying, that if it's in print, that at least feels like it's a little bit more level.
you can analyze.
Exactly. There's no inflection, right? Because even if they're just reading off a teleprompter, the person reading it is still
Yeah.
adding their inflection of their
You
emotion.
can pretty much tell how their slant is by what stories they write.
Yeah.
or what topics they write on.
So
Yeah.
that's what Kathy used to call newsstainers.
Yeah, and so even if it isn't the news, there's just constant information and ads and stuff thrown at us. Instead of it just being the thing that you choose to open or you choose to turn on, it's just streaming, blaring.
But
Some people just listen to stuff on their phones on full blast.
When it went to 24-hour news, they had to find a way to fill it, and that's when it went to that.
So it does make me think, like, how much are we all collectively dug into a hell, desensitized? You know, just all this stuff.
And you can see that in entertainment,
Mhm.
where what used to scare people, if you look at a horror movie from the 50s, early 60s.
Yeah.
Now you just get your popcorn and laugh through it. Back then, people
Yeah.
were more we've become very desensitized. Now you have to have blood and gore, somebody cutting head off with a chainsaw.
Yeah, well, you have to
before
keep
they
one
get-
up and
Right,
one
so
forward.
you can see how society's
I
become
still don't like that.
desensitized.
Yeah.
In a way.
Yeah.
So,
So that's something that hit me, but then the other thing that hit me alongside of that was on page 6. The last paragraph there at the bottom. The Baal Shem Tov, the founder of Hasidism, like Hasidic Jews,
right.
the Jewish movement that finds God in good and evil, in everything, once said, in remembrance resides the secret of redemption. So he's saying that in terms of like needing to tell this story. But if you look at the Old Testament, especially in the New Testament too, but the Old Testament over and over and over again, like Deuteronomy 6, hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is, slow to anger and God himself fast love. Like, love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your mind and all your soul. Write it on your doorposts, right? Hang it from the things on the side of your face. The lesson we had last week in church of, when you enter the promised land, every year go to the temple and offer the first fruits and tell the story again of how God freed you from slavery in Egypt and then got you to the promised land, and these are the gifts of God that I'm offering back, right? So really, really ingrained in the Old Testament is this sense of remembering, retelling the story, pass it on to the generations, write it down, right? And then the New Testament, they quote the Old Testament all the time. And Jesus tells the disciples, go share the good news. And Paul goes and shares the good news, right? So there's this sense of this urgency of retelling, of remembering the stories and retelling the stories. So in remembrance resides the secret of redemption. You put that alongside those who don't remember history or didn't repeat it, right? So there are Holocaust deniers who would read this, who would look at Anne Frank and say, oh, that's all a hoax, which blows my mind. But it's a strong contingent, partly because they've got platforms now, right? It used to be the fringe movement, but now they've got more people who will click on it, listen, and tell the stories, tell the wrong story, the wrong information. So more and more
A
important
lot of times,
to tell the stories.
those kinds of things,
Mhm.
some of the followers just become enamored with the leader,
Mhm.
not necessarily with the platform.
Sure, but then it starts to, with their retelling, it starts to sink in. People start to believe. So I like the image that he has where he's in the present day and he has the other pastor, I think it's pronounced Teese, and they're walking across the ice together. And each separately starts to slip. But when they're holding each other, linked arms, they're stronger together. And the village of Les Chambon, he keeps calling it a kitchen struggle, right? It wasn't like the guerrilla warfare that the resistance was doing in France. It wasn't like the armed military, battles. It was a kitchen struggle. It was decisions and moral wrestling being done in the homes. And Pastor Charlie was going to each home and teaching them and working with them and sitting with them as they wrestled with how they would help. So stronger together, less likely to slip together, retelling the stories, being in it together in your homes, not just having somebody preach at you in your pulpit, but really living it out.
Well, to follow up on your kitchen theme, is also, the women were more involved.
Yeah.
And, you know, I mean, you think of the French Resistance or whatever, and the guerrillas and whatever. Here it was, you know, the women who were helping to get these folks out of.
Now, there's another major note, is that security in numbers, that you're part of a larger conglomerate.
Yeah.
You have less chance of being picked out.
Yeah.
So you become a little bit more, energetic, I guess, is better, because you're not singled out, so you've got a chance to be less nailed, I guess, that way. So your courage increases because you're not out front of God and everybody there, you know, you kind of stuck in with the mass, you know.
And that's one of the tactics of the authoritarian regimes like the Nazis is isolate, right?
Yeah.
Divide people into smaller groups, isolate them, don't let them communicate, don't let them protest, don't let them, you know, organize so that they could have that stronger pushback.
Well, at one point he talked about in there how, I guess when he was being arrested, how the police had turned off all the telephone and telegraph,
Yeah.
so there could be no communication.
Yeah.
And then what did the police officer who was sent to arrest them see? The whole town showing up, being invited to dinner, giving gifts to people. He was in tears. He was ashamed that he was arresting these
Well, yeah, I
people.
thought, yeah, I mean, like you said, they tried to keep it quiet, but yet somehow everybody in town knew it.
Right, right. I love the scene in the internment camp when they start having worship services and the school leader is teaching them these songs and they're using like fake names to teach what they need to teach, and they're having this whole resistance movement right under their noses, and they don't even bringing people together by sitting and talking and listening to the other people's stories and not trying to make them believe the same way we do, but saying, well, here's what we believe and we're here for you too. Like creating a new Le Chambon inside the walls of the internment camp. It's very powerful stuff. One other thing real quick from me, Brandon, on page 11, just kind of his definition of ethics, since he is a teacher and scholar of ethics. What does he mean when we're talking about this? So, middle of page 11, it is plain that the story of the struggle of Le Chambon is of no special political or military interest, but it is of ethical interest. The word ethics can be traced to the Greek word for character, an individual person's way of feeling, thinking, and acting. Ethics is concerned with praising some sorts of character and blaming other sorts. In that region of ethics concerned with matters of life and death, as against, for example, professional ethics, sexual ethics, things like that, a person who destroys human life is blamed for doing this unless that destruction can be excused or justified in some way. Life and death ethics, a person who avoids or prevents the destruction of human life is praised for doing this unless a deed can be shown to be destructive of human life. So somebody breaks into your home and threatens you, you end up killing them in self-defense. People can say, okay, well, normally killing would be bad, but in this instance, we understand. Or the flip side, you find out, oh, the person lied about that and they just killed a person and made it look like, okay, then that would be the flip side, right? So usually destroying life bad, promoting life, saving life good, but with understandable exceptions. Ethics finds all those loopholes, right? Ethics is the branch of philosophy and teaching that creates a system but understands here's.
Well, and Bonhoeffer must have felt that way.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, the strong theologian who really wanted to fight for the rights of these people who were the Jews and the mentally disabled who were saying, well, we'll just euthanize them, they don't contribute to society, right? The Nazis were against more than just the Jews, but they were after all sorts of people. But, you know, Bonhoeffer ends up being involved in a plot to assassinate Hitler because he can't see any other way out of it. So he'll sacrifice his own personal ethics to protect life, to end a life. Whereas we get the story in the internment camp here of Trocmé and Tice refusing to give themselves freedom by signing one thing because it was against their code of ethics. Well, we can't sign that because then we'd have to lie later. We'd either have to go against our conscience by signing this and sticking to it, or sign it and then ignore it later. Well, we can't do that if we actually commit to it. So the other inmates thought they were crazy. you're absolutely crazy, take your freedom. One guy said, you know, you gotta fight the skunks, you gotta be a skunk, right? You gotta play dirty. Well,
He signed it with his alias.
what's that?
I said he should have signed it with his alias.
There you go, yeah. But even that, that's how admitted to their ethics. So, in life and death ethics, the person we blame is often called evil, and the person we praise is often called good, but you can also say bad and decent things. But if you talk to the folks of Les Chambon, as this author did to interview them, they were all very prickly about that. What we did wasn't good. We just did it because it had to be done. People needed that, right? So they're not thinking of it in those terms. That's partly as we get into, because they were these Huguenots who've been persecuted and hurt over the centuries, and because of Andre Trocmé and his background and the teaching he gave, those two dynamics together just created this atmosphere of course, you know, what else would we do? It's the right thing to do.
You wonder, I read in one of the Lutheran magazines somewhere, what the church doesn't have much to say about what's going on in the Middle East right now. Where is the church and their attitude, and what is it that they're supposed to be promoting? I guess it's the same kind of situation, you just don't know where you are and where you're supposed to be.
There are some folks that think that ELC is wishy-washy, or that our headquarters, our church-wide level, should be more definitive on things. But that's not the way our denomination is structured. A bunch of churches joined on in a lawsuit against the government a couple weeks ago for cutting aid to things like immigrants. You know, like if you saw the email that went out about Elon Musk said that Lutherans were laundering money and that we were taking all this money illegally from the government and doing all sorts of things. Do you remember the email the council sent out? Yeah, it turned out it was just government contracts to help duly vetted immigrants get settled or help unaccompanied minors find their families, like normal things that these Lutheran social service organizations have had contracts to do for decades. Oh, they went laundering. So the church, the presiding bishop did put out a statement on that to say that's not true. But other folks have wished that they'd gone farther or signed on to this lawsuit. And they said, well, the way our church is structured, to sign on to a lawsuit like that, you have to show that you've been done harm. Well, the way we're structured, they couldn't show, the lawyers said. And so we won't sign on. The church-wide denominational level can't sign on to this because how have we been? But if congregations who have immigrants who come to their churches or come to use their services could say, these policies are keeping people from coming because they're afraid and they're scared, then sure, that can show that it's doing us harm, because now some of our members of our congregation aren't coming to worship because they're afraid. So individual congregations could sign on, right? So it would be nice sometimes if church-wide had more definitive stuff, then you could agree or disagree with it, but it would at least be saying, okay, well, here's our policy. But because of the way our church is structured, with the most power, so to speak, lies at the congregational level.
I would say on every social level that I can remember, Lutherans have been blamed for being wishy-washy because we.
Yeah.
And I kind of like that. I think the individual members of the church can make up their own mind. I don't think the church should tell us.
Yeah.
How we need to feel.
More deliberative too, you know, oh, we're both in, right? Well, from this angle, but if you think about it, or here might be an exception. There are times where in the teaching documents and the social statements, the ELCA will take a pretty definitive stand, like there was one on the death penalty. We're against it. They had the moral side, they had the cost side, they had that it isn't really that much of a deterrent, here's the studies, but really it boiled down to our God is a God of life. And Jesus said, put that sword away, don't attack these people, turn your cheek, love your enemies, right? Go on the cross, forgive them, they don't know what they do. Scripturally speaking, we are against the death. That one they were definitive. Others, less so, were definitive in part, but with these exceptions.
Back in I guess it was the 70s, the big women's movement and things, there was a girl from Chrysler that was very involved. And she held meetings, I went to several of them and so forth. She ended up, I think, leaving the Lutheran church because she took so much flack.
Yeah.
But there were meetings at oh shoot, the one off the monument, at the end of the monument.
Epiphany?
Epiphany,
Yeah.
went to meetings there and Christ, you know,
Mhm.
in the seventies, I was quite a women's liberal, you know.
What were they trying to accomplish?
Women's rights back then, you know, back when women weren't allowed to,
And a bank
a
account.
lot of things, yeah, and their husbands had to co-sign everything. Yeah, you could, because I remember when I was first, I couldn't
Couldn't have a
get,
credit card.
I couldn't get a credit card without my husband's signature. There was a girl finally at, that bank, now they are now Truist, they changed names like 3 times. That's the reason I've stayed with them. There was a girl there who actually signed and got me my own credit card without my husband's name on it. And I mean, that was a rarity in the seventies to have your own credit card without your husband's name on it.
One of the things about the way this denomination works is because it leaves it up to the discretion of the individual churches and their.
Yeah.
And their,
Synods to a point, but mostly kind of.
right, but I mean, in their demographics, that works 2 ways. One case, it works very well, because like in the Missouri Synod, when I was in Lynchburg, we had the charismatic movement go through our church. And it was like water through a strainer. I mean, it really, really dumped it. Half the church disappeared.
Yeah.
Because the Missouri Synod didn't go along with that, of course. So the pastor had to be against it.
More top down.
Because that's what the Missouri Synod said had to be done.
Yeah.
And he ended up having a nervous breakdown, and half the church disappeared. It almost killed the church
Yeah.
because they weren't allowed to work on this on the grassroots level. It came down from the upper top,
Yeah.
and he was caught between a rock and a hard place.
Yeah.
And it gave him a nervous breakdown.
Yeah, very
He had-
different from
he had
this
quit.
scenario, very different from the scenario in the book.
Yeah.
Where, and we're gonna learn more about it as we go. Chalkney and Teese and Darcestock, how do you say it, started this school, worked on getting the passports falsified to protect people. Created the network, and you know, they were the ones that knew the big picture, and everybody else just knew their parts, right? Like getting
You
other-
pointed that out right
Yeah.
at the beginning, that he had working through the different youth groups.
Yep.
And one didn't, basically the right hand didn't know what the left hand was
That's
doing,
right, that's right,
but they were all part of this,
yeah,
that good. The other thing I thought, a point he made, and that's, it's always true, is that, stories like this never make headlines.
right,
He talked about, the different campaigns, he
Quiet.
talked about, theaters of
Yep.
war and
Yep.
things like that.
Yeah.
But, individual battles and stuff we talked about, but this kind of thing, and you don't know if it was done to protect what was going on,
mhm,
or if it was just, it doesn't sell papers.
probably a little of both. I mean, they weren't advertising it.
Well, at the time, it would be a death knell if they would have advertised it.
It tells the story of the village across the way that got razed to the ground.
Mhm.
Yeah.
But they did, I think, the movie industry after World War II, 1946 up to 1948, did do some of that.
Yeah.
They did highlight those types of situations.
Yeah.
The Train is a good example
Mm.
of a movie. There's several other ones. There's a Norwegian movie about Norwegians that did something like that.
Mhm.
So after the war was over with, they
The
did
stories
highlight
are-
those things between
Yeah.
46 and 48.
Yeah.
They didn't do them during the war for obvious reasons. So,
But at the
Well,
time.
for a lot of reasons, but yeah, but it's still, you just don't.
but the average history book didn't do that.
How many movies did they make about Pearl Harbor?
Right. Or
How
like
many
Saving
movies
Private
did-
Ryan, like the battles, right?
Yeah. Well, it sells.
It does. All right, moving into chapter 1 then, which part 1 is persons, chapter 1 is the arrest of the leaders. This is a really gripping story. From the moment that the police arrive in the kitchen, you get to know Magda, his wife, a little bit. You see how his relationship is with the neighbors, where he has gone into their homes, sat with them and listened to them and didn't talk down to them. We learn in chapter 2 where that came from for him, where he was in this youth group, so to speak, and people just listened and were there for each other and were honest and poured their hearts out to each other. And so that stayed with him, especially when you think of the stories of when he figured out that he was the elite, right? That his father was the rich guy in town and other people looked down on them, for not being more generous. So all those things made him who he was, and he brought that to this town and made these connections. Let's see here, page 20. Later, friends would say to Magda when she invited the police to eat dinner with her, "How could you bring yourself," it's about halfway down the page, "how could you bring yourself to sit down to eat with these men who were there to take your husband away, perhaps to his death? How could you be so forgiving, so decent to them?" To such questions, she always gave the same answer. "What are you talking about? It was dinner time. They were standing in my way. We were all hungry. Food was ready. What do you mean by such foolish words? As forgiving and decent." So was she being ethical here? Or is this just
Practical.
practical, right? Doesn't matter. Doesn't matter how she thought she was doing it if it inspires other people a certain way.
Just imagine how you get labeled in today's world if you
Sure.
ever tried that. Oh, my goodness.
Yeah.
Once the press heard that. Hmm.
Andre Chapin, when he's getting arrested, is actually a little bit excited. Because he's been praying for a test of his faith. Have you ever prayed for a test of your faith like this?
Yeah, say I have.
I mean, you hear stories sometimes about like maybe an athlete really wanting to go up against their biggest opponent because they really want to be challenged, show that they've got what it takes. So translate that into Christian living and ethics. Like, yeah, I really want to go up against the Gestapo. They're like the biggest rival we could have. So this guy was special. We could follow his example, we can learn from him, but we also need to recognize he's wired a little different.
Yeah, you stop and think about it, it's one individual against an organization.
Certain, yeah, very specific set of
Just by
circumstances.
that fact and that definition, you're gonna lose. And he knows he's gonna lose.
Yeah, unless you redefine what losing means.
Yeah, but I'm talking about in the practical sense.
Yeah.
He's gonna lose, he knows he's gonna lose.
Yeah, so then what's that?
What was that noise?
That's a water pipes.
Could be the heater. There's all sorts of noises.
Yeah.
Before the thing got fixed, every time the heat kicked on, it sounded like somebody had shoes in the dryer. Okay, but yeah, have you ever gone for a test? If we were in that same situation, how would we, I mean, that's a great ethical question, right? You read these stories, like, how would I react?
But
There's
you,
even a 2020 spin-off, like, what would you do, right? They set up those fake scenarios with, what's his name, John, starts with a Q. Quinones or something?
Yeah.
But it's like, what would you do in this situation? I go,
but
what would
you
you
gotta
do?
stop thinking about this guy, he knew he was gonna lose.
Yeah.
There's no way around it, I mean, you cannot fight City Hall and expect to win, and he knew he was gonna lose and he did it anyway.
Yeah. So would any of us be able to do that? Maybe we can't know until the pressure is applied, until you're in it. You'd like to think you could, right? But
Yeah. Okay.
Also think about to the police or the military who were doing the arresting.
Yeah.
They were just doing what they were ordered to do,
Yeah.
and if they went against it, they could be court-martialed or thrown in prison. I mean.
Yeah.
I'm sure a lot of them maybe did not like what they were doing, but they didn't really.
And the officer was crying while he was sitting at the
yeah,
table.
the people who did the arresting were different than the guy at the next station who just thought they were.
But that's kind of funny how, the French after the war, when you were a collaborator, you really were in trouble. I mean, the women especially, and then most of the men, they would hang them and shoot them. The one I did,
Think of
what always
Tale of Two Cities, right?
what always
The
shocked me
women
was
thing.
that the Vichy police,
Yeah,
they weren't put upon after the war, which totally fascinates me. They went after civilians with a vengeance,
sure.
but they did not do anything to the Vichy police officers after Germany fell, and I found that fascinating. I don't know why, but I do. They went on to business like they kept their jobs and did everything just like they did beforehand.
Yeah.
But yet the civilians that were collaborating with the Nazis were in deep trouble.
Well,
They should know that.
the difference is the issue was. They were doing, I mean, they were doing a job, they were doing what they were told.
Yeah,
You know, they didn't necessarily, you know, whereas a private citizen, you know, they were doing it because they wanted to.
well, I understand that, but they were still
Right.
picking up people and picking up the Jews and sending them to the concentration camps. And yet after the war, they weren't ostracized, they weren't victimized, they weren't brought on charges. I just fascinating me.
Who wasn't ostracized in?
The Vichy.
The Vichy police.
Let's turn to page 30. This kind of hit me. I'll get your take on it. I've been talking enough. Could somebody start with the second full paragraph? This was a moment Truck made. And we'll just read that paragraph in the next one.
I got it.
Okay?
This was a moment Trockmade would never forget. In fact, his overnight stay in the police station in Limoges
Sure.
changed his view of mankind. He discovered people like Captain, patriotic, sincere, but above all, severely limited. These people were capable of repeating hate-ridden cliches without any concern for others or the pain of the others. Before he entered the police station in Limoges, he thought the world was a scene where two forces were struggling for power, good and evil. From then on, he knew that there was a third force seeking,
Hegemony.
thank you, hegemony over this world. Stupidity over this world, stupidity, God and devil and half-wits of mind and heart were all struggling with each other to take over the reins.
All right, let's do the next paragraph and then we'll talk about God and the devil and then the third one, stupidity.
Deschambault had been spared the Cretans.
Yeah.
In the south of France, people called the village the Republic of Le Chambeau because somehow it managed to remain a world of its own as impregnable fortress in a murderous world, a place that could not be made a party to the compromises and murders of the French around it. The moral isolation had kept out the Cretans, or at least had quieted them and assimilated them so that Tromé, or whatever term, how do you pronounce that?
Yeah.
Tromé had not seen them parading their Grecianism. Now and for the rest of his life, he knew that there were some people, indeed many people, who did not realize that suspicion and hatred were doing to their own minds and to their victims.
Thank you. So he calls them severely limited, right? They're not bad. In fact, he says they're patriotic, sincere, and, you know, just doing their jobs, right? But limited, right? They don't realize what their suspicion and their hatred, repeating this hateful stuff, was doing to themselves and others. Right? What do you think of that? There's good, there's evil, and there's stupidity. There's God, there's the devil, and there's, what do you call them, half-wits of mind. Does that ring true for you? Or does that mean?
They're halfwits. I think they're just uninformed because, you know, some people just don't want to know what's going on.
Ignorance is bliss.
Yeah.
So can you hold somebody accountable for
Well,
willful
I think
ignorance?
we can.
It doesn't necessarily mean that they're dim-witted, it could just mean that
They don't want to know.
they're toting the flag, but they really don't know why they're toting the flag.
Maybe the light went out and they're choosing not to put a new bulb in. Right? But I thought that was there's a lot of stories of that.
Well,
When you look at,
in some cases,
Time like
it's safer.
oh
Yeah,
yeah,
I was gonna say,
because
just
if you know,
don't want to take sides.
because if you take a side, then now you have responsibilities, right?
Yeah, it's safer to
Yeah.
be stupid than to be ignorant.
Yeah,
And maybe they didn't know which side to take.
and when you look at how fast that thing, the Nazis took over, and how fast they were changing things. And at first, how their military was just rolling over everybody. Then maybe it was better just to say, keep
Well,
it
you
down.
see,
Pick your point.
when the movement first started in Germany, I think things were in bad shape,
really
and so in the beginning, people thought it was a good thing, I think, and then, you know.
If Hitler would have died in 1937, he'd been a hero.
Yeah.
I'm saying.
Yeah, but he
He got
been a
caught
hero.
up in his own.
Yeah,
overextended.
he got caught, what happened was, there's two ways you can unite a country, that is with hate or with love.
Yeah.
And there was no love in Germany at that time because of World War I and everything they did to them.
He took all the fear and all the economic inflation and everything and turned that
He
into,
put them all to work, he
gave him a target to
gave
aim
a
at.
target, gave something to unify the country.
Yeah.
And like I said, if he died, and then there was a bunch of people in this country that thought he was doing the bang up job.
Very much so.
So if he'd have died in 1937, we would think him a whole lot different than we do now. So that's just, but he got caught up in the machinery that he built. He got caught up in the machinery he built and got to be bigger than him.
I mean, I don't know why this one thing sticks out in my mind, but I mean, to make your point, I mean, he invented the Volkswagen, which is the people's car. I mean, that was
And the Autobahns, they had the best highway system, or did have in Europe at the time.
Eisenhower stole that concept.
But but that's just it, like, here we are, like, getting into the minutia of it, but at one level. As far as Chalkmay saw it, there was good and there was evil, but then he discovered this third
There's a
person
gray area.
who just didn't engage.
Yeah.
Were okay to be limited,
Pretended they didn't see.
or made sure that they couldn't see. So that's a strong force in this world. I don't know if that's something that scripture addresses a lot, maybe in Proverbs. Proverbs covers a lot of like wisdom and the foolish and the wise, but what does Jesus say about the foolish? Jesus doesn't quote Proverbs very much. So I do wonder, Paul likes to divide things into flesh and spirit, Jews and Gentiles, right? He does a lot of either ors. And then he follows it up with both ends. But I can't think of a lot of, maybe the book of James, well, faith without works is dead, right? Well, you've got faith, but if you're not living it out, that kind of puts you in this.
Well, I can see why they did do that, because.
Oh, yeah, I'm not trying to
Because
say it
when you're
doesn't
an
make sense.
eccentric of what, or not an eccentric, bad word.
Yeah.
When you are dedicated to a particular
Of
cause,
course,
you don't see anything but that.
yeah.
So it's either this or that, and if you're against me, they don't see the area in between.
Well, that's what I was talking about earlier, when I was talking about that, when you use the term halfwits.
Mhm.
It's people that just, they buy into something, but they really don't think about it,
Sure.
they don't. If they were to stop and think about it, or
Yeah.
if they were able to think about it,
Mhm.
they might change their mind, but I mean, I've seen perfectly logical people that buy into a certain,
Mhm.
and it's like, you can't convince them, that it's hurtful.
Mhm.
Well, there's the instinct of survivability is hard to overcome.
Yeah.
Um,
And if it gets, whatever your platform is, if it gets tied to, I need to believe this to survive, it's really hard to
yeah, it's hard to come over that
speak truth
instinct.
to it if it's actually is harming other people.
Mhm. It's a primal instinct to try and survive,
Sure.
and you will justify things you do to do that. And-
Oh, yeah.
So,
We could do a whole nother talk
Yeah.
on
Well, he
justifying.
talks about that in the prelude, the
Yeah.
fact that he was an artilleryman
Yeah,
in the war, and he was fighting. Even though he knew killing was wrong, but yet to kill in that sense was okay.
think of
He knew he
Chalkmay's,
was, when he shot those shells off, he knew people were gonna die, but it was for the greater good what he was doing, I guess.
yeah, there's a movie, it's called Enemy Below. And it's about a destroyer against a German submarine. And one of the comments that's made in there is that they were talking about, the doctor was there talking with him, he says, what do you think they're doing down there? And he says, he says, I don't really want to know my enemy that I'm gonna kill, but I'm gonna try and destroy.
Yeah.
So we don't wanna know who they are,
So,
so.
I have a parallel story to this, so I've shared before that in seminary, we had the opportunity to have these J terms in between semesters, and there were international things that you could sign up for, and we figured we've got student loans, when are we gonna get to do this again, let's take advantage of this. So one of those years we went to Namibia, which is just northwest of South Africa, that had been under apartheid rule. Large Lutheran presence in Namibia, long-standing ties to the seminary we went to. It's a great story, but I'll just do the short version. We visited a tribal king and queen. Things ran late, they didn't have lunch, they felt bad about that, so they wanted to honor our visit. And they gifted us with a 1-year-old male goat, very biblical, right? We were in a tour bus, so the goat ended up pulling in with the luggage, and we finished our tour, and made the other stops we were supposed to make, you could hear the goat kind of going, thump, alarm. But we got back, and where we were staying, they were gonna butcher the goat and throw a party for us the next day. And, Liz will tell the story, she grew up in the city, and this was very hard for her, some of the others too, like, here's this goat, you can hear rolling around in the bus. And to think about eating it, she's like, when I go to a restaurant and order a steak, I don't wanna know the name of the cow.
Yeah,
Right? It's a funny-ish way to say it, but same thing, like if you put a face and a name and a backstory and make something three-dimensional, it's much harder to hate it.
yeah,
And so that's why propaganda just makes things
or they,
exaggerated and says, well, these are your enemies,
or soldiers will say,
all of them, paints with a wide brush.
if you listen to a soldier.
Yeah.
That was in battle, did you hate your enemy? He says, no, I didn't hate him, I
Yeah.
didn't know him, how can I hate somebody I don't know? It's just, it's either him or me, so
Yeah.
you kind of justify. That
You have to find ways to make
you have to survive, and so that instinct of survivability always kicks in.
Think of Andre Chakney's story in chapter 2, where he has these encounters as probably a teenager. With first, there's that horrible image of the German soldier going through town and his jaw has been blown off. And he's just wrapped in bandages, and there's just where his jaw should be is just bandages dripping like blood clots, right? It's this horrific image. And that hits him. How could this be my enemy? How could we do this to anybody? Because he saw firsthand what happens. He met that other German soldier who had found religion and found Christ and said, I'm not going to kill anybody anymore. I'll still serve my country, but I'll be a telegrapher. I won't carry a weapon. I'll put myself in harm's way. That blew his mind too. They invited this German soldier to their French group to pray together, right? Like he started to have holes poked in his justifications and in his.
There's a well-known photograph of France, and there's this German soldier kneeling at the altar in a destroyed church.
Sure.
With really, it's convoluted, it's not thinking of that, they destroyed the church, the Germans did.
Yeah.
This German was in there kneeling in what was left of the altar praying.
Finding shared humanity undercuts
Well, it's just like.
dehumanization.
Not every German was bad.
Right.
Appropriate to share this, but I can remember as a child, my parents shopped at a supermarket. We lived out in Goochland, Louisa, out that way. And then my parents worked in town, so we would go out Broad Street to go home. And we stopped at this little market, Friday grocery night, And I remember my father stopping and talking to this guy. And I guess, I don't know where he knew him from, but, he introduced me and we were chatting with him. And we'd see him in there periodically. And this guy had been a Luftwaffe pilot in the Second World War. And you gotta remember, this was the early '60s, so it was, 15 years or so after the war. But I remember thinking, the guy was a nice guy. I thought Germans were,
Yeah.
Yeah.
But they were drafted like you and I, or like we were, so.
and that stuck with me all these years. Here this guy was a Luftwaffe pilot, and yet, you met him and he was just as normal as
Right.
me or you. Well, I don't know how normal I am, but anyway.
But point taken. Well, let's look at page 34. Somebody like to read that second paragraph that starts unlike other groups.
Like other groups in the camp, political doctrines from that part of their thinking. An intimate, logical and religious judgment caused their deep ambivalence about the victory at Stalingrad. Ray had a desire, as he put it in his notebook, not to be separated from Jesus. What does this mean to him that God had separated from Jesus? What does it mean to him that God has shown mankind how precious man was to him by taking the form of human being, coming down to help human beings find their deepest happiness? Treme believed also that Jesus had demonstrated that love for mankind by dying for us on the cross. And that these beliefs sounded too mysterious. He knew that Jesus himself had refused to do violence to mankind, refused to harm the enemies of his precious existence as human beings. In short, Jesus was for Treme the embodiment of forgiveness of sin, and staying closer to Jesus meant always being ready to forgive your enemies instead of torturing and killing them. Treme could not bear to separate himself from Jesus by ignoring the precious quality of life that God has demonstrated in the birth and the life and the crucifixion of his son.
No wonder.
I didn't leave these parts out.
No, you got one.
You did. No, it's not a coincidence that in the first couple centuries of the church, while they were arguing about what was orthodox and what the theology would be, that it ended up becoming one of the most important, biggest fights and most important points to say that Jesus truly was 100% human as well as 100% divine. He wasn't just a spirit with a person mask, right? He wasn't God just pretending to be human. He had to be 100% human so that the redemption of humans was 100% effective. And it's for reasons like this. This is the scriptural theological foundation of Trocme's ethical practice.
One thing,
How he lives it out.
during that early church, this is off the subject, I was going to say, this, during that period, early church, what if they made a mistake and they accepted the belief or a doctrine that was incorrect? But that's not this discussion, so someday we can.
I mean, we have what we have inherited. There's still debates and there's still schisms and denominations branching off. But you have to trust that the Holy Spirit's working through all the mess. And then if we're off, that hopefully we're getting steered back.
Good answer.
You know, hard to know
I
though.
find this guy very intriguing.
Which guy? Trocme?
Yeah, Trocme.
Mhm.
Because on one hand, he's saying that he doesn't hate anybody.
Mhm.
It's not his point to hate anybody or do anything, and yet he had to make a decision to fight's not a good word, take a stand against one side
Sure.
over the other, and yet
Well,
that would be hard to
I
deal
don't
with.
really, you can't say that he even really took a stand against it, because all they were doing, like they pointed out in there in one phrase, they were just doing what you're supposed to do.
Yeah, but it was a stand against it. He
Well-
knew that he was going to be in trouble if he got caught.
Granted, but it wasn't, he didn't do it to make a stand, he did it because it was the right thing to do.
Mhm.
He also understood the consequences
Yeah.
of his
Well,
actions,
I'll
but
go with that, yeah.
But it was, it was just, they said it in there somewhere, is that, it was just, we did it because. What else were we, what else were we supposed to do?
Yeah, they couldn't ignore it. They couldn't be limited. They couldn't close their ears to it.
So
Because they-
The interesting thing was, how did the, and I guess like a lot of things, they didn't have Facebook back then, but how did, because, in the prelude, I guess he talked about where he was giving a speech in Minneapolis, and he had that mother that had 3 children that had gone through that village to be sheltered.
Yeah.
How did people know which way to go?
We'll get there. Yeah, we'll get to that, how they set it all up. That comes later. But I will say that, over and over again, I keep coming back to, he talks about the priesthood of all believers, which is sort of a Lutheran thing, and that image of the two of them linking arms on the ice, that you had to get through it together. And because of what happened to the death of his mother in the car accident, and how the poor people looked at his rich family, because of the war, all the things that made him who he was. He couldn't not see the preciousness of life in any other human being, whether they were a Jew, a Christian, atheist, an enemy. He couldn't not see the preciousness of life. Somebody else. What were you gonna say, Jim? Oh,
No, I was just saying you didn't intend for it to be. Oh, well, I forgot to talk to you now.
that's all right. Yeah. Let me just do one last thing then. This isn't the overview. This is something specific that I felt like maybe ties into current events. So we'll have like 2 minutes to touch on this. But at page 48. Down towards the bottom of page 48. Okay, so this was about kind of what was making Andre Charlie tick. Instead of trying to pluck out the heart of his mystery, the key to his mind, let me try to answer a rather modest question. What events in his life can help us to understand his belief that human life is priceless? It was in service of this belief that he made Les Chambon a city of refuge, which is a term taken from the Old Testament. And if we can understand that belief in terms of his life, we shall be ready to, so that then he gets into the background, right? So, but this little thing here, city of refuge, which is an Old Testament term, that's where people like the Levites who didn't have land, or the aliens could find, like, anybody who was in trouble could go to one of these cities of refuge and be safe. Is that where sanctuary cities comes from? You know, the immigration debates of today, of some cities or whatever declaring themselves, even some churches will say we're a sanctuary congregation. Is that where that comes from too, do you think, or is that a different thing?
Couldn't you go into the church and hold on to the altar if someone wanted to come
Sure.
to grab you to take you away from holding the altar?
That's actually part of the goat story too. It got out the night before the barbecue and they found it hiding in the church. And one person said, oh, it was looking for sanctuary. And another person said, well, it needed to confess its sins because it knew it was about to. But I wanted to throw that out there. Like, I know faith and politics, a lot of folks say I don't come to church to talk politics, right? I get that all week long. I want to come to church. But if our faith isn't influencing how we live our lives, because politics, the root of it is people, right? The word is polis in Greek, like Annapolis, Indianapolis, it just means people. It's like a city. So if we found ourselves in a situation this extreme, that's one thing to say, how would we handle it? But in the situations we are in right now, what does it mean to view every single life as priceless and precious? It doesn't mean there's no consequences to actions. You still have to pick sides and take stands and deal with the world. But what does it mean in terms of how we see other people who are themselves looking for a city of refuge? Because that's a big topic. And maybe I'll just throw that out there. I'll lob this, grenade of a thought out there. Maybe we'll start with that next time.
City of refuge.
Cities of refuge. There's so much more, but I hope as you read that this is doing good things for you, giving you good things to pray about and chew on, food for thought. This book challenges me in the best kinds of ways, makes me have to think and be introspective, and that's why we're reading this for Lent. Section 2 is called Beginnings, Part 2. It's 1934 to 1942, and that goes up to page like 118. So it's 77 to 118, give or take, chapters 3 and 4. That's what we'll do for next time. All right. Thank you, everybody. Great conversation. Thank you for sharing your stories and your perspectives. Don't forget also to pick up our, if you don't have one already, God Be in My Head, or check out. I've found this to be wonderfully, surprisingly good for me too. Like, it's very simple meditations, but it gives you a lot to chew on.
If you can't get, I've got some kind of mental block against that first stand.
God Be in My Head.
I get to God to be in my head, but I never can remember the second part of it.
Oh.
I've repeated it 10 times.
And in
several
my
times a day.
understanding, and in my understanding, yep,